Do you make house calls?
I'm trying. I'm trying.
That's what my bank account is, flat. So,
Weight and balance. The first thing when you're building your aircraft, the most important thing is the structure. It's got to be a sound structure. It doesn't matter what happens after that. If the wings fall off, the tail falls off, the landing gear collapses, the most important thing is a sound structure. And the second thing, that sound structure has to balance. An airplane is nothing more than a lifting surface. Getting it off the ground, it's going to lift whatever's on that airplane, wherever it's at on there, whatever you add to it. It's strictly a lifting surface. And what it uses to create that lift is a wing. And that wing has to have motion through the air in order to create lift. And that wing, if you take every little spot on the wing and combine them all to a single source, it's called the center of lift. And that usually is, let's say, in the 25% area of the chord. And there's the range on the KR, the plans call for 15 to 35% weight and balance. But that center of lift changes constantly. Different airspeed, different pitch, all of those things, that center of lift will move back and forth in the wing. Now, in order to be flyable, you have to keep this balance of this airplane, everything on there, within that range of that center of lift. Well, with everything changing all the time, your fuel's burning off, the balance is moving. You can lean back in the airplane, it'll climb, you're changing the CG, the center of balance on your airplane. So we need to keep that airplane balanced. If we think of it as a single point of balance, it has to stay within that center of lift. So there's a certain range. And as it changes, you can't change anything on the wing or anything, so that's what your tail surface is for. Your elevator is a compensator. In order to keep this balanced as your center of gravity, your CG changes, you use your elevator to make up the difference. Like on a teeter-totter when you were a kid. The heavy kid moved in. So this is your compensator as your weight and balance, as your CG, your center of gravity changes, your tail compensates. And we've got to stay within that center of lift area, otherwise the aircraft is uncontrollable. So we have to figure out how we're going to know where our center of gravity, our CG, is at. Because you can change things. Move your battery forward or back, allow baggage, no baggage, where you're going to put how's the pilot going to be in there? Are you going to be more reclined? All those things changes where this airplane will balance at.
fuel?
Fuel, yeah. More or less fuel as you burn off fuel, so it's constantly changing as you fly. Mathematically is how you do it. Let's call this a tricycle here. So we have okay, now how are we going to find out where a single point on that airplane would be if we suspend that? Where's it going to balance at? We know we have to have it within a certain range. How you do it, you pick, there's some terms. It's called a datum. Where are we measuring from? Some will pick the firewall. Others pick the front of where the prop is at. You could actually pick the tail if you wanted. If you had a tail wheel and had a scale back there, you can work from the back. I read somewhere where the airliners on the large jets, they actually pick a point out in front of the aircraft. You only need to know how far that point is from your scales. You're going to put scales under here. and you're going to have a weight on those. I picked on mine, I picked the forward face of a 5-inch prop extension. I figure I'm not adding anything out beyond that. If you use the firewall for your datum, now you've got negative numbers out to your nose wheel. Keep it simple. See where your nose wheel, the axle, drop a line so you know where that nose wheel line is at on the floor, and measure out somewhere even past the nose, let's say 5 feet. Use that for your data. All it is a mathematical calculation. And it makes it easy because everything is positive. So pick a datum that works. If it is your firewall, don't forget you're working with negative numbers on your nose wheel. So, make it simple. So there's a couple of terms. One is the datum. Where are you measuring from? Let's use the front of the prop. Somewhere up there. That's our datum. Now we need to measure from there to this scale, and from there to the scales on our wheels. So this is your datum. That's where you're measuring from. Now the distance is your arm. How long is your arm? That's the distance from your datum to your scale. And when you have your aircraft on the scale, drop a line on the floor so that you know exactly that distance. Use your axle. That's where the center of the tire is going to be on the scale. So when you have it on the scale, okay, so now you've got distance. That's your arm. On your scale, you have weight. Let's just pick some weights. 200 pounds on each main and 100 pounds on the nose. This is a pretty light airplane. What you do is you take, from your datum, you take that distance in inches times the weight. Your distance times weight equals, they call it moment. That'll be a very large number. It could be 76,000, who knows. If you've got 100 inches and 200 pounds, now you're at what, 20,000? Give it whatever that number is. So you're dealing with these high numbers. Don't let that confuse you. Take the distance times the weight, and that's the moment. In our case, and in every case, if it's a nose wheel or a tail wheel, you'll have 3 scales. One very important point. The aircraft, when you weigh it, has to be perfectly level. If it's not, you're shifting weight from one scale to the other. And that will throw off your CG calculation. So you take the distance times the weight, and you get moment. And you'll have 3 of those. Distance times weight, moment, and distance times weight equals moment. Add all those moments, those big numbers that you got from multiplying the distance times the weight. You've got 3 of those, add them all together for a total. And divide that total moment by the total weight. That answer is where your CG is at in reference to your datum. So you go back to your datum, and whatever that answer is, measure out, that's where your CG is at. But it's a pretty simple math if you keep it simple and don't use negative numbers. Does that make sense what you're doing to this point? So you're working out mathematically. Basically what you're doing is averaging these scales. When you multiply it out and divide it, you're bringing.
It's important you end up with inches. If you do it math with inches and pounds, you end up with inches from your datum point. Right?
Yes. Yeah, it will be, if you use feet, it would be feet with fractions or something. Keep it simple, just go inches. You don't want to have to convert from 5.28 feet back to, how you're going to measure that up. So keep it simple. Use the length, the arm in inches, and the weight in pounds. And that gives you your moment. Add all the moments together, divide by the weight, total weight, and that tells you where your CG is at. And the range on the KR, on the RAF 48, the plans say 15 to 35% of chord. Chord is from the lead edge to the trail edge. So whatever 35% of 48 is, would be your aft, and 15 would be your forward. And it lists that in terms of 8 inches behind the lead, from 8 to 16 inches behind the lead edge. 8 to 16. But everybody says that that's too far back. Don't use that last couple of inches of the planned CG. So that's where you want to fall. Now you have to figure out, where's the fuel tanks when I start adding things. When I get in there, I'm a 200-pound passenger. What does that do to my CG? And how do I get the number? How do I calculate the number? Where my arm is? Where's that weight concentrated? 200-pound pilot. You'd be amazed when you're setting in like this. A lot of your weight is in your legs. It's forward. You'd think you could take right the center of
Your butt.
but your body weight is not distributed equally for that.
Actually, your belly button works out about right.
Yeah. Well, you can do it mathematically and nail it to an inch. What you do, once you have this, throw somebody in there of known weight. Let's put a 200-pound pilot in there. The weight on these scales are going to change. Somehow the combination of all 3 of those will equal 200-pound addition. You're putting 200 pounds in there. However that spreads out across the scales, you recompute that. The distance times the weight of each scale, and you'll come up with a different CG. Okay, if you take your total moment has when you added all the moments up, now you've got a new total, and you've got a new weight. Take the difference in that total moment, that big number, divide that by the weight that you've added, and that will tell you exactly where that pilot or passenger CG station's at.
And then keep that number. Put that number
But
in there.
that's the number you always use. If you put a
passengers.
100-pound person in there, it's still the same arm. But now you know exactly where that arm is at. Arm, again, that's the distance. And you do the same thing for fuel or anything. Fuel tanks are a little bit easier. You kind of know where the center of that tank is. And if it's linear, the center of that, drop a plumb bob, and you can measure from that, wherever that plumb bob is at, back to your data. That gives you the length of your arm for that fuel. Larry?
How do you convert weight into inches?
You don't convert weight to inches.
How do you do that calculation? Can you do one?
Well, as your weight increases, your inches get bigger. But in this case, it's distance times weight. It's just numbers. You're not converting them. It's what you're doing. Let's say it's 200 pounds at 100 inches. That gives you what they call the moment. So you're not converting one to the other. You're multiplying the weight times the arm.
Well, 200 pounds times 60 inches, let's say.
That'd be 6,000 or 60. Whatever it is, I don't have a calculator.
So would it be?
It's been 55 years since I graduated high
Would you
school.
say that's inches, or would you say that's what?
It's moment.
It's
Moments
moment.
in inch pounds.
It's moment.
Units are inch
Moment,
pounds.
moment, nothing. It's just moment.
Yeah, inch pounds.
That's your moment. You have your length is your arm times the weight is a moment. It's not a moment inches, or it's just a moment. It's a big number. That two numbers of different things were applied multiplied together.
For each tire, so he's got 3 weights for each tire.
You'll have 3 weights. If it's a tail wheel, you'll have a scale way back there, and I use a datum of the forward face of my prop flange. So I've got 193 inches from the datum back to the weight on my tail wheel, which was, I forget, it was 18 pounds when it was level, something like that. So you can deal with some high numbers, but it's pick your datum and make it easy. Your datum, the point you're measuring from. If you want to put it 10 feet out here, that's fine. It'll work every single time. It's just, you're just having set numbers and set distances. So I had 193 inches all the way back to my tail wheel.
Can you go ahead and figure that out?
Yeah, can you use your plane and,
Use
and
your
do the math
plane
on the wall,
to
please?
give us your center of gravity. We can use some funny numbers.
Yeah, that's
I mean,
good.
it's-
Well, use
your
the
numbers
numbers
would be
right-
fine.
use the
I
numbers
mean,
you
my
got
numbers
there.
are out in the airplane. It works. Doesn't matter what airplane you got, how much it weighs, what it is, it works every time on your airplane if you do it correctly.
Do it on that one up there so everybody can see it.
They need an example, is
Okay.
Larry, you want something?
Okay, kids.
You want something?
I will use some real numbers and you'll see what happens.
Okay.
You got it?
Let's get your airplane in here in 3 scales.
If you want, Larry, here's this.
Can we get it through the ceiling?
Here's John's.
Right,
That's a tailwheel airplane.
I'm not gonna use that. I'm just gonna show some
Okay.
examples of numbers. There's a form that you put it down on and
Find
get
that
all
map.
your answers, and you're supposed to carry that in the airplane. But in theory, on every flight, it's gonna be different. So if you actually go through that, you know, you'll have different numbers. But we'll just work some numbers so it makes it more, obvious.
But basically on the RAF 48 wing, it's supposed to be back 8 inches to 14 probably,
Yeah.
8 to 14. Is that right?
Okay,
All right.
if you wanted my airplane, the critical thing on weight and balance is to get the airplane level. Don't have it out in the wind. You want a side opening canopy or a? There's our wing. There's our motor and propeller. You want a back window?
Yeah.
I don't have one.
Okay, you want a tri-gear or tail wheel? It
Tri-
works, any way you do it, it's gonna work.
Try, we'll try gear, it'll be easier for you.
It's all the same. Somebody's gonna have a calculator and give me the numbers, so I don't care which.
Go for a try gear.
We'll go for the tri-gear. Okay, let's pick an easy datum.
End
And
of
you,
winter.
you would want to
Tip of the
record this datum in your logbook, so anybody figuring weight and balances, you don't want it to change. You got a VW engine, make it very specific what your datum is. Let's say the datum, we're gonna pick a datum, the forward face of a 2-inch thick propeller. Mine is the forward face of a 5-inch prop extension. But you want something that's not gonna change, something you can measure from. So we're gonna pick the forward face of a 2-inch propeller. Okay. That's our datum. Now we put a scale under each of these wheels and pick a weight.
300 pounds per main gear.
A really heavy one, huh?
Well, it'd be, well, yeah, that'd be pretty heavy.
You want 300 pounds on each
Let's do
main?
200 then.
300 on mains, I suppose. Mine was two, mine
We'll
was
go
two.
300, we'll make it easy.
Yeah, mine was
For somebody to-
275.
300 and 300, one under each wheel. Sometimes you'll get a different weight on one side or the other.
Yeah, probably 100 on the nose or something.
100 on the nose,
Simplicity
okay.
sake.
Okay, what's our measurement? Let's call it
30 inches.
30 inches, you want to use 30 inches?
I
Okay.
suppose that's probably further than it is.
That's way further than it's gonna be.
20 inches then?
It doesn't matter what numbers we use, it'll always come out the same. And yours is going to be exact to your airplane.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter what numbers. How far back here, what numbers do we want to use? 6 feet,
72 inches. Make it
72
70.
inches, okay.
Make it 70. 70 is easy.
70's easy.
So you got 300 on the front.
3,000.
Back there, David. Okay, who's
3,000
got?
on the front.
Okay, let's-
3,000 on the front, and
let's
then
record
we got
this.
300 times
100.
170.
30, that's our arm, to our scale of 100. Okay, and
3,000.
70 times 300 twice, what's 70
2100.
times 300? Just give me the answer.
51,000.
How much, 51,000?
Yeah.
I don't think so. 2,100. Wouldn't it be?
One. That's each times 2
70
then.
times
We
300.
just do a total. Total both weights and
Okay, give me the moment, the answer of arm times weight.
3,000.
3,000.
3,000 here.
21,000 for the others. And each one is 21,000.
Each.
Yes.
Each,
So
21,000.
21,000 is our moment on the.
Yes.
Okay, what's our total?
45,000.
45,000,
45, yeah.
and we're gonna divide that by 700. 700 was our total weight, that's our total moment.
64.
45,000 divided by 700 is what?
64.285.
Say again?
64.285.
64 and a quarter.
64.
Yeah,
64 and a quarter, you got it.
Okay, so at 64 and a quarter, this is not the scale. So it's forward of our main gear, so at 64 and a quarter, that's our CG empty. See how that works?
Yes.
Multiply the 3 scales, the weight times the distance, or the arm, and you get the moment. This will be your moment, weights. You add all the moments together and divide by your gross weight, by the total weight, and that is your distance from your datum to your CG.
That's your empty CG.
where do we
Well,
want,
that's empty.
Yeah, that's your empty CG.
Well,
Your,
it's whatever the CG is with whatever weights you have in and what their station is.
could be full,
It's
could be
the
empty,
same.
whatever you did.
You'll get a different math if you start putting stuff in here, but that CG is always, that answer is always where your CG is at.
Hey, Larry. Larry, so if you put yourself in there, the guy that's gonna be flying it all the time, and then get somebody to check those weights while you're in there, and then redo that, what if you're kinda aft, you just start moving stuff forward?
All you need to do is determine where your passenger or your pilot CG is at. You can do that with a 100-pound kid if you want, and then later, just do the math. Make it a 200-pound and do your math, and it'll tell you where it's at. So you can put, but you would want to find your pilot and passenger arm. Where's your arm, how far it is from the datum. You'll want an actual person, not a sandbag sitting in the seat, because the weight's not distributed the
Yeah,
same.
so the simplest thing would be, since you're gonna be the pilot, just get in there yourself, right?
Yeah.
So what happens when a 100-pound pilot gets in there? You're gonna have to recompute.
Nobody's flying my airplane after I build it.
100 pounder probably.
It doesn't matter what size pilot you figure it with, it's going to tell you where that arm is for whatever is in there. So get your wife in there and you read the scales. I'd prefer reading the scale to sitting in there and taking her word for it. She might have extra insurance on it.
But the 64.
Reading.
The 64, 285 or 240.
Okay, hang on a second, we got a couple questions.
You're suggesting doing the CG for the empty aircraft, and that's one number, and then you take another measurement, which includes the pilot and or passenger, to get that CG, which is what you use in your fly time, and the same thing with fuel. Where
You can do the same thing with everything
But
there,
those are
baggage.
variable. Those are variable, but the standard CG is what you're
But the
saying.
arm is always the same. What you'd be determining is the arm. Where's that station? If I put baggage in there, how far out is that baggage from my datum? Next time, you'll have a different amount of baggage, but when you do your math, you'll know where your CG is at, because that arm always stays the same. The weight will change, which changes the moment, and when you do all that, you'll know where your CG is at with that particular load. You know, now I got a 100-pound pilot flying this thing, and they want to put 50 pounds in the baggage compartment. Well, you do your math, because you know where your datum's at, you know your arm to each location. You do the math, and it tells you if you're in the CG range or not. John?
Something that Langford reminded us yesterday is empty airplanes don't fly so good. So your empty CG is an interesting thing, but it ain't never gonna fly without somebody in it.
Right.
So make sure that your pilot, you might have a minimum pilot weight, but that's gotta be part of your calculation. Full gas, empty gas, that is variable. But the airplanes, my next door neighbor had 100 pounds of lead in the tail of his Mustang until he said, oh yeah, I weigh 160 pounds and I am way forward. That 100 pounds of lead turned into 40 pounds of lead when he did the calculation with somebody actually sitting in the seat.
You have a form that should be in your airplane. The critical thing is your datum, and where your datum is at, but your arm. Where's the moment of that?
That 64,285 is the red line on the wing right there.
Yeah. So this is
And
not
that
the
was-
scale, but
That divided by that comes up with the 64,
Yes.
so that's where you count, that's where you measure back to the same.
you took, you know your
Same
inches,
point.
you know your arm,
Yeah,
times the weight on those scales,
yeah.
add those all together, and you get your moment. Take all your moments and add them together. What you're basically doing is averaging those three out. You know, if I had a single weight, where would it be out here? How far from my datum? That's basically what you're doing. Now, anytime you change your scales, you know where your moment, your
Center of gravity.
well, the CG changes. The
Right underneath your 740, the 64,285 number, that way you realize that you took that divided by that.
and that equals 64.
64,285, I think.
Hey Larry, how do you kinda know where to put your engine without like pre-making the motor mount and then start adding little aluminum spacers or whatever?
Thank you, Larry.
There's no way.
Where should the
Other
empty,
than- other
where should
than-
the empty CG weight be? If everything is adjustable now, where I'm gonna be Sunday, where should I set the empty CG weight?
You don't set
Empty
the,
CG is
Or the
basically
datum.
immaterial. You need to know where it's at. But you're never gonna fly it with a totally empty CG. You might want an empty CG being
Forward, how much
of
forward?
where your flight CG is at.
that's exactly right.
So that when you start adding pilot and passengers, if you start in the middle, now you could move right out the back.
Yeah, it's not
So-
uncommon for the empty CG to be forward of your CG range.
Right.
Yeah.
Because everything you add, fuel, passengers, baggage, is
For the
usually
most part,
added to the
unless,
CG.
yeah. So,
Empty
um,
CG, yeah.
Yeah, you need
That's
to
the
know where
point.
your empty CG is at, so that when you start adding things.
But the empty CG in most of our cases right now, being that we're still building, is adjustable. Based
Can
on
be.
moving the engine, based on all the variables.
You have to get to a certain point before your calculations start
So,
meaning anything.
But his point
Before
also,
you build your motor mount?
yeah, so his point is also that you wanna take.
If you have some way of hanging that engine out there, you know what the weight is, do your scales now, start figuring with a different arm. Because what you're changing on your motor mount is the arm.
That's what I did with mine. I did the CG before I ever mounted the engine, because I didn't know how far out the engine needed to go to make it balance right.
Yeah.
So I did the calculations with no engine on the firewall. And I weighed the engine, balanced the engine, so I knew exactly where the center of the balance of the engine was, weighed it. And then you can do a CG on that, and you can figure where it needs to be to make your CG come out.
Yeah, I mean,
It
it's
tells
definitely-
you how,
So you take-
how far on it.
You take your 700 pounds, subtract your engine weight, and then you can move that engine, move the arm of that engine
Right.
weight
Yeah.
to where you want to get your empty CG to be. And as Pete's saying, you start loading the airplane after, and the CG is going to move aft, but your empty weight can be balanced by how far you stick the engine out. And I think that's what your question is, Paul.
I made a temporary motor mount, allowed me to move my engine forward.
You don't
There you
have to
go.
have a temporary motor.
And then I could build one after, but you're right, I could have done it just numeric.
And remember, if you've got a tricycle gear and you're doing an empty weight without the engine on there, if you hung 25 pounds up here,
So it doesn't tip over.
so it doesn't tip over, now you're,
Tear.
that's tear, but I'm not sure how you subtract that. You'd almost have to
They got an
build
arm
an
on that.
arm on it and, got it.
And what do you suggest for getting that center of gravity thing figured out when your fuel tanks are empty? And put fuel in?
Measure them empty.
Measure 'em
So
empty.
before you put the fuel in it, when you measure this out and it comes out there,
And how do you, and you know that if you got a header tank, it's gonna move further forward.
if you know where the header tank is at, you can.
Weight tank.
And if it's a nice square tank or something that, you know, unless it's slanted and more to the back of the tank or the front, if it's a nice, tank like that, you can just drop a plumb line
Yeah.
and then add that
Or you
weight.
can set a 5-gallon bucket of oil on top of there and kind of mimic that, sort of.
Weigh it empty, weigh it
Sandbag.
full.
Sandbag.
You use your fuel as your last things where you take your measurements on, otherwise you have to unload all the fuel like baggage. You know, check everything else, your baggage, your passenger, what else you want to put on there. Do all that first, and then maybe you got a header tank,
Extra weight in it.
fill the header tank, and now you, with calculations, you'll know what the arm of that header tank is at. By all your new moments, and divided by the difference in the weight that you've got now, and that'll tell you how far that header tank is from your data. So that's your new arm. So now you can, once you establish that, next time if you've only got 5 gallon in there on your form, you can figure out where your CG is at mathematically. Once you've determined where your arm is at, the distance from the datum to your weights, now you can play with numbers all day long and find out, well, what if I have a 120-pound passenger, how much weight can I put in the baggage and stay in the seat? All these things, you just change the numbers. You do no more measurements or anything. Once you've determined what the arm is and the empty weight, and if you add 50 pounds of baggage, well, you know the total weight is going to go up by 50 pounds, and at that point, it doesn't really matter where it's at, because that's what you're going to determine.
Larry, when the DIR does your inspection, do they want to see several different combinations of empty weight, weight with passenger, weight with fuel, weight with, they want to see several different versions, right?
You want to have
Yes.
different scenarios in there. What's the worst case scenario? You know what your empty weight is, and let's say your empty weight is forward of the CG. What's the lightest pilot that can fly that thing and stay in the CG? Do that mathematically. It may be a 120-pound pilot is the minimum to bring you into the correct CG rating. But that's all math once you know what the arm is. And then you run all the scenarios. With me and full fuel at my weight and full fuel, my fuel is pretty much right in my CG area. So I fall almost dead center in the CG with me at 225 gallon of fuel. If I start a passenger baggage, I get in the rear real quick. But you can figure out all of your worst case scenarios mathematically once you know what the arm of your fuel is, how far it is from the datum, baggage, pilot, passenger weight, scenarios. And from that, you can, he's got an example. From that, you can kind of, in your head, well, you know, I know if I have a 200-pounders in here, I can't have any baggage. I mean, you know what these absolute scenarios are, and then you can do it kind of in your head as easily. If you're not sure, go ahead and do it. The KR plans has the weight and balance.
It's got those scenarios in it, you know, empty aircraft so that you can figure out the empty CG, and then pilot and passenger, and luggage.
So when you
My
check out
my
those
DAR actually made me use his form.
Oh, yeah.
Not only could I not, I had done mine in Excel, but he
He had
gave
you do it
me
later.
his Excel form and wanted me to do it on his Excel form.
Before he actually came to do the inspection?
Yeah, he sent it to me like a month beforehand, and he wanted all of those scenarios. He wanted the empty, he wanted the max forward, and he wanted the max forward.
Yeah, you're gonna have to you're gonna have to prove it's a flyable airplane and know what weights, where it's going to affect that CG.
And this is coming from the plans, the original plans, that's what.
This comes right out of the plans book. There's all kinds, there's stuff on there's software on the internet. You can just type in your numbers and it'll do it for you.
I just wanted to understand what they're using for reference, they're using the plans for reference, right?
Well,
That's a sheet.
this
out of
is in the
plans.
plans. It's a blank form. So there's nothing about a KR that's specific in here. It will be your airplane. And you can do the same thing on the end of the software on the internet. Because mine's a tail dragger. And I stretched it 24 feet, so I'm 193 inches back. 24 feet. That'd be 993 plus 24 feet. So anyway, your KR, it depends on the gear you have on it and the datum you pick. So they just give you a totally blank form for you to fill in the numbers. And you can do the same thing on the software, on the internet or whatever. But that's, determine a datum, make it easy for math. If I would have picked my datum as the firewall, this forward would have been negative numbers, and I'd be over here subtracting that from this. Don't make it complicated. It's more complicated it is, the easier it is to screw up. So, keep all the numbers positive, pick something way out here, so everything's a positive number, you add them together, divide by the weight, that's where your arm is
I'll go blank, take a plumb bob or something and drop it
Oh,
down there.
well, as far as doing it,
Something
yes.
like that.
It's critical, make sure it's level with, from your datum, drop a plumb bob. Now you have a line on the floor. Go back to your scales where your nose wheel axle is at, and where the axle is here. Measure, take a carpenter square. So let's say I'm on the side of my airplane, and this is where my axle is at, and this is my carpenter square. Slide that along the floor until I go right to the center of my axle. Mark that point on the floor on both sides. Pull a chalk string. Now you've got, you know exactly where it's at, and an easy thing to measure. So yeah, mark those lines on the floor, and then your that will be your arm for those three, and then just start making your changes in weights.
So you gotta draw a square line across the front of the airplane, out even if you're landing here to measure that, right?
Yep.
It'd be best to have people on the same.
So you can measure back to the main gear.
No, measure the center line. Pull a chalk line between your two axles.
Across the two,
Pull a chalk line
Oh,
between
yeah.
your two axles.
Yeah.
Now you've got a line right across it.
straight there, then you measure back to that.
Now measure from your datum to that. And then you measure from your datum to where it'll be tougher to drop a line off your nose.
Yeah.
Maybe
but
off-center.
It's easy.
Off-center a little bit.
Yeah. But yeah, then now you've got a line right down the middle of your KR to the datum. You can make your measurements. And then when you, as you change weights and get different weights on your scale, you can take that same carpenter square and move from your datum and go out to 64 on the floor. Set your square straight up, that's where your datum, see where that falls. And then you can drop a line from your lead edge of your wing. You can drop that to the floor. Now where did that 64, how far forward or after that? So, you know, make it easy on measurements using plumb bobs and
3 times.
squares and that kind of stuff. you ever understand the theory? Pick a good, easy datum, get good measurements on arm, how far it is to your scales, and then simply do the math. Start with totally empty CG, probably want to add a passenger, then find the weight of your arm of your baggage area, put a known weight in there, 10-pound sack of sugar, 25-pound weight, whatever you use, a known weight. And now when you recalculate, it will tell you where that arm is at. And that goes on the form. That never changes. The weight changes, but the arm should never change. So that's the way to determine where the stuff is at. That's, where's that at? So you can get it exact to the 10th of an inch if you measure. Does that whole thing sound reasonable on the process? It's a multi-step thing, but it's really quite simple. And once you have these arms and stations there where it's at, you can do math all day long.
So you can just mark all your marks on the floor, then move your airplane somewhere else and weigh it.
Once you got all the weights,
with your scales in a way, it'll be more difficult to get your center of axles and stuff on it.
whatever works.
Yeah.
But you've got to know what, you'd have to leave it there long enough to get those weights on the scale. So you'd know what changes when you put that baggage in there. And I guess you could move the airplane and measure on your marks on the floor, but.
I just got it freshly calibrated.
So, any other questions?
From our EA checker.
There's no other questions, and I'll talk later if somebody has questions and wants to go into it a little bit deeper. Something came up, a comment or something came up earlier today. Somebody was talking about how the KR flies and it's poorly or something. The next time you're driving down the highway, 70 miles an hour, consciously stop and think, move that wheel a little bit. Feel that pressure and see what little movement it takes to change lanes. That's flying the KR. If anybody can drive down the highway and keep it in lane, you can fly a KR. That's what the KR is going to feel like. That's how small of movement it takes. And if there's nobody around, do this with the wheel. That's what happens with the KR too. So if you want to get a sense on how your KR is going to fly, about 70 miles an hour down the highway and just ever so slight movement. You can't even hardly see the wheel move.